Okay, so let's conclude this chapter before we go to the problem set on redistribution policies by talking about subsidies, targeted assistance programs, and universal basic incomes as redistribution policies. So we already talked about subsidies in the context of some micro, and we know that subsidies cause a cost and a deadweight loss from inefficient overproduction. But there's more to it. So many countries, for example, subsidize flour, gasoline, or cooking oil to reduce the hardship for the poor. Well, the problem with a subsidy is that it has a huge inclusion error. So inclusion error means that the whole idea of a redistribution policy is that you want to target the most vulnerable. But if, let's say, a country subsidizes gasoline, but a rich person in a poor country drives a Ferrari or a Mercedes or a Bentley or Rolls Royce or another expensive car, then the gasoline subsidy also favors that very rich person that you don't want to target. So the problem with subsidies is that it has a huge inclusion error, which means you spend a lot of money on subsidizing a good without necessarily limiting the subsidy to only those who really need it. But this is ultimately the objective, that makes redistribution policies effective. You got to redistribute from those who have it and don't need it to those who don't have it but need it, and not redistribute from everyone to everyone. That will not work. So the golden rule in redistribution policies, it's the buzzword is always, or the keyword is, targeted assistance programs. So many countries, they hand out food or education vouchers as so-called in-kind transfers, or they may hand out simply cash as a cash transfer. And of course, most economists favor cash over in-kind transfers because that they assume that the most vulnerable people know best what they need. But the problem with those targeted social assistance programs, where you identify the vulnerable people and give them, either something in kind or in cash, that you have a high exclusion error. So for a let's say a developing country to introduce a targeted assistance program, they need to have a very efficient public administration that identifies truly all vulnerable people and doesn't leave anybody out. And so the ideal is a targeted assistance program, but the reality is that because many developing countries do not have an efficient public administration which is capable of identifying all the vulnerable segments of society, they prefer to introduce a subsidy or a price floor or a price ceiling or something simple. But then they also create a huge inclusion error. And it becomes very expensive. In many countries that have, let's say, that subsidizes, for example, gasoline, but they also need to import the gasoline from the world market. And then if the gasoline price of the world market goes up, then many countries can no longer anymore afford to import the gasoline, and then very often you will see public riots or political instability because the subsidies can be very expensive, and they may pose a huge vulnerability to a country. So again, targeted assistance programs, it's typically the way to go. but it requires very efficient public administrations. Again, a final word on the difference between a cash transfer and an in-kind transfer. So some years ago I was doing some work for the World Food Program, and so the concern was refugees. So like after 2003, the second Iraq War, many Iraqis, mostly Sunnis, they fled Iraq and they ended up in Syria in the Middle East. And they lost everything, so they were very poor. They were maybe not very poor back in Iraq, but with all the political changes following 2003, they got really poor. So now the World Food Program was trying to help, those Iraqis who fled Iraq. And one of the problems was that many of those Iraqis, they were so desperate that they didn't eat right and they drank lots of alcohol or consumed drugs. So now the World Food Program said, okay, what we need to do is we need to give them in-kind transfers. We need to make sure that they have only access to, let's say, food and water and milk and cooking oil and nothing else. Okay, yeah, the responsibility of the World Food Program is to save lives and of course not to give people just cash so that they can buy drugs or alcohol. But the problem was, after, the World Food Program gave those vulnerable refugees vouchers to only buy, let's say, their food and nutritious meals in certain stores. They went there and then they bought the food there, but then they sold the food and then they used the money from the food sales in order to buy, let's say, alcohol or cigarettes. So that was a huge problem. So generally, most economists favor, cash transfers, but there are also limits to it. So development aid can be very complicated in practice. And there's a final one, which is the universal basic income. And the idea here is that everyone, whether you're a millionaire or a poor beggar, gets $2,000, whether you're rich or poor. And the basic idea is that the basic income should cover all your basic needs like food, shelter, and basic health care. But then, and that's probably the attractiveness to it, it should just replace all the various governmental social safety nets like unemployment benefits, healthcare subsidies, and retirement pensions. So those of you who like to read the Bible, they may remember that there is a passage somewhere when Jesus says those who don't want to work shall not eat. Well, that would be an argument against the universal basic income. The problem is that bureaucracy is very costly too, and everything in economics is a trade-off. From a purely ethical perspective, for example, I personally wouldn't be a big fan of a basic income policy too, but I can see that if there is a tremendous opportunity to dismantle a lot of administration and bureaucracy, I could see the benefit. But anyhow, so somebody needs to do the math, and like everything in economics, there are pros and cons to it. But those are, the major redistribution policies that you will see. It's about subsidies, targeted assistance programs, universal basic income, that has gained a lot of attention in recent years. And of course, earlier in the course, we also talked about things like, price floors, price ceilings. And So you should have at this point a pretty good overview over those various concepts. And let's just stop here, and beginning with the next video, let's start working on the problem set and review again everything.